Now, from Washington, the Inside Scoop. All the news the government does not want you to know. Here's your host, Congressional Attorney Mark Levine.
Good evening. You've probably noticed by now, if you're paying a little bit of attention, that I'm not Congressional Attorney Mark Levine. My name's Garland, Nixon, and actually I work with Mark. We host a radio show together, and we go on Fox News and together and do all kinds of fun things. And today Mark's not available, so I'm going to be taking over the studio, shall we say, and we're going to have a lot of fun. Mark will be back soon, but today we're going to talk about something that I'm sure you're going to find very interesting. We have with us Mr. Brian Czech. You with us, Brian?
Yes.
All right. We have with us Mr. Brian Czech. I should say Mr. I should say Dr. Brian Czech because he has a PhD. But what we're going to talk about is called environmental economics. I'm sure you've been paying attention. It's been a little hot lately, as some people have predicted. Things are kind of going bad as far as the weather's concerned. We've had to learn new words like derecho or however that's pronounced. But at any rate, there's some bad happenings, and we need to find out what's going on and if there is a solution. How you doing, Brian?
Good.
Great.
Wonderful.
You wrote a book called Shoveling Fuel for a Runaway Train. That we got to talk about. And let me just say this about the book. I'm a prolific reader, and I mean a prolific reader. I've read hundreds and hundreds of books. Of the books that I've read, Shoveling Fuel for a Runaway Train is in my top 5, and that's saying something for the number of books that I've read. Number one, because of the subject, but number two, because it's a very fun read. I mean, you did a great job. But why don't you start off, Brian, by telling our audience what Shoveling Fuel for a Runaway Train is all about?
Well, it's all about the problems caused by economic growth. It's about why there's this crazy theory that there's no limit to economic growth on a finite landmass like Earth, and it's about some of the history behind why that belief has occurred, and it's primarily, however, about the alternative, which is a stabilized or steady state economy that would in fact be sustainable on a planet like Earth.
Great. It's interesting, and it's particularly relevant now because of the issues of climate change that are becoming so apparent. You know, I was reading an article the other day that said back in 1988, a group of climatologists got together and predicted that by the year 2010 or 11, 12, somewhere in there, that we would have as many as 10 days per year wherein it would be the temperature would rise to 95 degrees or greater. This year we've had 23 so far. So the issue of environmental economics and your issue of unstoppable, of basically unstoppable economic growth is very pertinent because, and I'd like you to talk about a little bit about how it's expressed in the book. There is a direct relevancy between economic growth and our environment, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about how you express that in the book and some of your theories about it, which probably aren't theories anymore, I might add.
Right. Well, when we do that, we have to start by reminding everybody what economic growth really is. Economic growth, it's nothing magical. It's simply increasing production and consumption of goods and services in the aggregate. And so what that means is it means more and more people and more stuff, goods and services. And we measure economic growth with the metric called gross domestic product, or GDP. And when we recall that basic definition, it's pretty easy to see that that's going to have a footprint on the planet. And the easiest way to see the environmental problems caused by a growing economy is to think of the other species on the planet. You know, we've seen a burgeoning list of federally threatened and endangered species and state endangered species. So that was pretty obvious. Most people can pick up on that right away. Pollution air, water pollution, these are other problems that are readily connected to economic growth. Climate change that you mentioned, I'm very careful, Garland, never to hang my hat on climate change when it comes to demonstrating the fundamental conflict between economic growth and environmental protection. But clearly, in a 95% fossil-fueled economy, economic growth equals increased greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore the anthropogenic portion, at least, of climate change.
Yeah, and certainly what we're seeing now with the droughts and what some people call droughts, I call it our climate, parts of the country converting to a desert. And personally, when people say there's a drought in Texas, I kind of say that's like saying there's a drought in the Sahara Desert that's been going on for the last 2 million years. It's not a drought anymore. After 5 years in Texas, they got to realize that's what's happening, and at some point, we're going to recognize that people can't live in a desert, and they're going to have to move northward. But we just haven't come to that realization yet. However, let me say this: in the book, one thing you mentioned that I thought was interesting is that you said when it comes to our economy, it all starts with plants. How's that work? Can you explain that to our viewers?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a very profound issue to consider because it helps us to understand exactly why there is a limit to economic growth. Well, first of all, let's start with what we call the economy of nature. That's every other living thing on the planet besides humans or Homo sapiens. You don't have any animals at all unless you have plants. And the plants are called, real fancy ecological term here, they're called producers. They're called producers because they produce their own food with the process of photosynthesis. Mm-hmm. And they also produce a surplus amount that can then be consumed by animals. So, for example, mice and deer, they eat plants directly, mm-hmm. and bobcats and mountain lions, they eat animals. So you have producers, primary consumers, and secondary consumers, a few other kinds of species. Mm-hmm. In a typical ecosystem. And then when you throw humans into the mix, you see that they're like the highest level in that, we call it trophic levels. Mm-hmm. And but once again, everybody knows if there's no plant kingdom, there won't be any other animals in that, and including humans. Mm-hmm. So, and one more thing about that, when you can to some degree consider the human economy separately, but even then you recognize that unless you've got agricultural and extractive surplus, you're not going to have all the other, you're not going to have the manufacturing or service sectors. You have to have that foundational level of producers, which in the purely human economy is agricultural and extractive sectors.
Well, that's great, and it's interesting because it takes us back to the recognition that we only survive because of the natural world. We kind of get this idea that we are some species that has evolved past the natural world, that we almost don't need Mother Earth anymore. But I think that what you're saying it clarifies that. Right now, we're looking at nationwide droughts. I think 48% of the 48 states or something, all 48 states have some areas that are experiencing drought. And, it's pretty predictable that within the next 12 to 24 months, we're going to see food prices skyrocket. It takes, 3 pounds of grain to create every 1 pound of beef? And as we start running short of grain, the food starts running short, the rest of our economy, whether we want to continue expanding or not, as our food products start to decrease based on our plant producers, everything else has to drop too, doesn't it?
Yeah, it is unfortunately, such an outstanding example of the basic principle. It reminds me, not too long ago, one economist said something that I felt was like a red flag over the whole economics profession. They said, don't worry about agriculture. That only accounts for 3% of GDP.
And 100% of food.
Yeah. I mean, when you have an extremely productive agricultural and extractive sector, why then yes, the prices of those foods and other and raw materials will be relatively cheap. But man, like you say, when you get a major drought, a long run drought, then the chickens come home to roost. And
it sounds to me like this I believe you said it was an economist. He very clearly articulated the problem, and this is an important problem, that we see food as some kind of an economic commodity, that we don't recognize that, oh boy, only 3%. Well, we can certainly survive if we lose 3% of the gross, national product, but we can't. That 3% means the other 97% is irrelevant, and that's the issue I think we're dealing with here. And in your book, one of the things you talk about, one of the things I like about your book, once again, we've got Mr. Brian Czech. He teaches environmental economics, which we're going to talk about environmental economics in the next segment, but he has a book called Shoveling Fuel for a Runaway Train. We're going to talk about environmental economics, which his book discusses, and we're going to talk about the solution, which is a steady state economy, and how that compares to Keynesian economics. But at any rate, I lost track, which I'm prone to do. But whatever the case, why don't we start now? Let's talk about Keynesian economics, traditional economics. If you can explain that in a very simple way that people can understand. And then how the steady state economics, well, we've got a minute, so I don't think we have time to quite get into Keynesian economics right now. I'm sure you're a brilliant man, but I don't think you could explain the intricacies of Keynesian economics in 30 seconds or less.
Well, Keynesian economics is all about how to handle macroeconomic problems, and it goes back to the 1930s, his theory on employment and interest and money. So when somebody like a President Obama or any statesman attempts to quote unquote stimulate the economy, that is a Keynesian practice. Okay, so we're going to get out of here in about 10 seconds. We're going to do a PSA. We'll be right back. We're talking with Mr. Brian Czech, author, Shoveling Fuel for a Runaway Train. This is Inside Scoop.
Listen to smoke before you give it a try. Only you. Don't play with matches. Don't play with fire. Cause there's nothing very funny about $3,000. Nothing very nice on a homeless mind. So if a gorgeous force is what you desire, don't play with matches. Don't play with fire.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
Fire.
Why don't you just wash your car at home?
When I wash my car, everything runs down the street and down into the storm drains. With all the chemicals in the soaps and waxes, the last thing I want to do is poison my own drinking water.
At least here, it's all contained and recycled on site.
That's why I also take my car in for oil changes instead of doing it myself. I might take a chance on spilling stuff.
You know what the best part is?
What?
More time to kick back and watch the game.
How far would you go to protect the planet?
I want you to build an ark.
Here we go. Okay, that's good. Oh, okay. Ow!
Maybe there's another way.
People, the flood is imminent!
Is it too much to ask for a little precipitation?
Go to fightglobalwarming.com to find out what you and your community can do to reduce global warming pollution.
Somewhere around the world, there are men and women of the armed forces risking their lives, helping rebuild communities after natural disasters, collecting toys for needy children, tutoring kids in school. These are your sons and daughters who work to keep us safe, secure, and free. Dedicated men and women who put their country first.
Here again, The Inside Scoop with Mark Levine.
Hello, welcome back to The Inside Scoop. My name's Garland Nixon. I'm standing in for Mark Levine today. We're talking about important stuff. What we're talking about is how economics, we're talking about economics, how it relates to what's going on in our environment. And we have Mr. Brian Czech, author of a book called Shoveling Fuel for a Runaway Train. And I'm telling you right now, this is a really good book. If you want to understand how our economy equates to problems in the environment, and it's a fun read, it's a good read. He talks about his horse trip and all the fun things that happened when he was took a horse trip through the West. So it's a great book, it's a fun read, and I really think you ought to get it. Mr. Brian, are you there?
Yeah.
Great. So we were talking about something that you teach, I understand, at Virginia Tech, right?
Yes.
You teach environmental economics. I think we need a dose of that right about now. Tell us about environmental economics.
Okay, well, just to clarify, I teach 2 courses there in the National Capital Region of Virginia Tech, and one course is ecological economics, and the other one is steady state economics. Technically, the phrase environmental economics is basically a subset of conventional or neoclassical economics, as they call it, that's directly pertaining to environmental issues. But ecological economics is a little bit different. It's, in fact, it's significantly different because with ecological economics, you start with the fundamentals of the natural sciences, physics and ecology especially, and you build your economics around that, or I should say within those the sound sciences. And so that right away, that helps us to see things like limits to economic growth. The first 2 laws of thermodynamics, for example. You can't make something from nothing. That's the first law of thermo. Second law, you can never get 100% efficient in any production process. Those are standard rules of physics, and those alone establish that there is a limit to economic growth on a finite planet. So when in ecological economics, we start with that issue about limits to growth, and from there, that requires a few additional things that you normally don't get much of in conventional economics, and I'll name one of them. When you recognize that there are limits to growth, well, then you have to deal with the issue of the distribution of wealth, because if you recognize that the pie only gets so big, and you have to deal with how big of pieces can go to individuals, individual people, and individual countries on the planet. Whereas in conventional econ, I think it's turned into a bit of a cop-out there, because if you claim that there is no limit to economic growth, like they still do claim in neoclassical econ, well, then you just say, oh, a rising tide lifts all boats. So you never have to deal with the issue of distribution.
So ecological economics, which you teach and specialize in, deals with not only the issue of how we operate our economic system within an ecologically sound environment or model, but it also deals with the distribution of wealth, which, let's face it, is becoming a very serious issue. How does the ecological economics deal with that or address that issue?
Well, it's an issue that one way to deal with it, sort of combining it with the issue of limits to growth, is by using a method called the ecological footprint. And so an individual, a family, a municipality, a county, a state, a nation state can be measured in terms of the amount of space on the planet Earth that is required to support its existence. And if that amount of space happens to be much bigger than the area of the country, well, how does that look in international diplomacy, for example? And So what I like to advocate these days is what I call steady statesmanship, and that is international diplomacy for getting nations to develop a responsible attitude and practice with regard to the size of their economy, so that they and the rest of their friends on Earth, their will fit on the planet sustainably.
Well, that's a perfect segue, that statement, for moving into another issue, and that is Dr. Czech here, Brian, once again, for those who may have just tuned in, the author of Shoveling Fuel for a Runaway Train. It speaks of ecological economics. Has a website and advocates for a steady state economy as opposed to a constantly growing economy. You know, we've come to the point now, I mean, based on what we hear on the news, based on what's presented to us as a sound economic model, we've come to the point where we're waiting for the latest economic growth numbers, and we hear, oh, hooray, we had a 3%, a 5%, a 10% economic growth. And what you're advocating for is a steady state economy where the economy can be healthy without growing. As we know now, if our economy doesn't grow, we fall into a recession or depression, and we can't continue to grow forever. And tell us about the website, so our viewers can go to that website, and we want to move to talking about what's the difference between what we have now and a steady state economy.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that website, steadystate.org, because it is a place where people can sign a position on economic growth, which I think is instructional in this context. Because if you look at the people that have signed that, there's close to 10,000 people now, and these are some of the top scientists on Earth in sustainability matters, as well as a number of other dignitaries, diplomats, and commentators of various kinds and so forth. But anyway, back to the question per se, the biggest difference between a steady state economy and the current one is that in a steady state, you're actually your goal is to stabilize the footprint, the size, the volume of that economy. And unlike some of the pie-in-the-sky talk you hear about information economy and green growth and all that, there really is no way to stabilize the footprint without stabilizing population and per capita production and consumption of goods and services. So that essentially amounts to stabilized GDP. Another way to look at it is, people, especially a lot of people in government and politicians and so on, they do not want to talk openly about the problems caused by economic growth, because the people are still sort of programmed to be so pro-growth. So because of that, you can't really talk openly about the problems. You can kind of view it as an 800-pound gorilla sitting in the corner of the room. Now, if you think about the growth of that 800-pound gorilla, it's got two arms. And one is population, and the other is per capita production and consumption. So you have to treat them both, because that economy grows as an integrated whole. You can't just have per capita consumption growing or just population growing. They're both going to grow in a growing economy. I'm afraid, Garland, I didn't get a lot to your question. I should just say it and then tell me if I need to say more about it.
No, you're right on the money, because we can't. You're an economist, and certainly we don't want to lift the hood and pull out all the wires and get into all of the intricate details that will bore our viewers. Trust me, I'm good enough at boring viewers. I don't need any help with things that people don't understand. But I do. I think you're doing a great job of breaking this down. If someone goes to steadystate.org, they can join. They can. What can someone do if they want to go to your website and they want to be a part of a movement that will, in fact, I'm going to put it this way, that will save mankind, as it were, if we look out 200 or 300 years from now?
Mm-hmm. Well, if we have a number of resources there that are freely available. Slideshows and various publications, books, papers, peer-reviewed scientific journal articles. We also have a blog there. We call it the Daily News, D-A-L-Y. We named it after the father of steady-state economics, Herman Daly. Mm-hmm. And Herman writes a monthly piece for us. There are 4 of us that write regular weekly pieces. And we have guest bloggers at times. Anyone can join the conversation there. But I'd say the highlight of steadystate.org is our 16-sentence position on economic growth that was designed especially to refute that old political rhetoric that there is no conflict between growing the economy and protecting the environment. Remember that rhetoric was very prominent in the 90s, and it still is fairly prominent, and it's extremely dangerous, reckless, and fallacious, corrupt rhetoric.
Kind of like back there when they used to tell you that cigarettes would make you healthier.
Yeah, a lot like that.
Yeah. So something else I really that I want you to expound on a little bit. So in your book, one of the things I recall reading about, but I don't remember, but I thought it was very interesting, you talked about an environmental formula, I believe it was, K-select, Y-select, etc. How animals in the forest disappear. I mean, I don't want to get too morbid here, but what happens? Well, we're down to a minute, but I want to get into that a little bit next. I don't want to get morbid about us all, humankind all disappearing, but it's certainly something we need to talk about. But the effects in the natural world of what happens when you don't address these types of issues, when there's too many rabbits in a particular forest, when when there's too many deer or too many apex predators, etc. What happens? We certainly as I said, we don't want to seem like doomsayers, but let's face it, you got to call a spade a spade. If you see something that's looking kind of scary, it's in our best interest to bring it out. So maybe we've got about 15 seconds. I want to thank Mr. Brian Czech, who is the author of Shoveling Fuel for a Runaway Train. We're having a great conversation, and we're going to scare our viewers next and talk about what could happen if they don't listen.
Too many women get hit by their boyfriends and husbands. Too many women are pressured into having unprotected sex. Half of the people in the world living with AIDS are women. It doesn't have to be this way. Together, we can change this reality. Let's strive for a world free of violence.
At Volunteers of America, we don't just give kids a way to stay off the streets. We give them the tools they need to reach their full potential. We don't just help the elderly receive needed care. We help them live life to the fullest. We don't just provide food for homeless individuals and families. We provide job training and placement so they can buy groceries. Volunteers of America is a national organization that for over 100 years has provided programs and services that allow people to overcome their challenges to become vital members of their community. At Volunteers of America, we don't just help people, we help people help themselves. Find out how you can support the programs that are working in your community. Contact Volunteers of America today. Call 1-800-899-0089.
Drivers face all kinds of distractions.
Guys, stop playing now. Of 127 consecutive.
Before your wireless phone becomes one of them, stop. Drive safely. Keep Keep your phone in easy reach and dial sensibly. In bad weather or traffic, call later and use a hands-free device. Remember, with wireless, safety is your call.
Here again, the Inside Scoop with Mark Levine.
Hi, my name's Garland Nixon, and I'm standing in for Mark Levine, trying to fill his shoes. And although Mark's not with us in physical form, I'm sure his spirit is floating around the studio here. We're talking to Mr. Brian Czech. He is a PhD. He's an ecological economist. He teaches here at Virginia Tech, and he wrote a great book called Shoveling Fuel for a Runaway Train, and I commend that book to you. I'm telling you, you got to read that book. And I don't mean just a good book from a local guy. I mean a great read. You will not only learn, you will actually absolutely enjoy the book. Brian, so it's time to frighten our viewers. Maybe we can scare them enough that they'll go, they will, let's say, motivate the legislators that represent them to act. So let's talk about it. In the forest, you got too many rabbits, or they eat up all of the basic foods, and everybody craps out. You get too many apex predators, they eat up all the rabbits. There are a lot of bad things that can happen. Let's talk about how that natural model applies to mankind, and let's go there. What happens if we don't fix this?
Well, I'm glad you asked it, because I think it probably resonates with the common sense of 90-some% of listeners out there. What does happen? Well, you really don't have too many choices. What are the basics? Well, one is war. If you don't have enough resources for the people within your country, you can go to war and try to get more. And you mentioned before the break, we don't want to get morbid about this, and I really don't, but...
Let's get morbid about this, Brian. We really do. You got to tell people that. You got to lay it on the line. Let's not wait for it to sneak up on people. Let's tell them how bad it can be and what can happen.
Well, okay, so in the case of war, a lot of people forget that the Nazis' justification for rolling into Poland originally was a doctrine called Lebensraum. They needed living space, living room, and that's because they were running out of resources for their economic aspirations within the borders. So that's one of the classic examples. But when you think about the hotbeds around the world in terms of conflict, increasingly it's obvious that these are resource issues. Water conflicts in the Mideast, oil conflicts. Mineral conflicts in Africa, and so on. So war is always one of the likely outcomes of overshooting a nation's capacity for its economy. Of course, massive starvation is another one. And those who would oppose our instruction in ecological economics on about limits to economic growth and the need for a steady state economy, they would portray these facts as quote unquote Malthusian doomsday scenarios. But let's use our common sense as well as sound science, and like you say, call a spade a spade. When you run out of space within your country, the choices are not pleasant, and there is war, there's starvation, there's disease, and there, of course, is a very unjust distribution of wealth as the rich and powerful commandeer more of the resources for themselves and their cronies and families, and
I suspect,
and the rest suffer.
I suspect, Brian, I suspect that within the next 24 months, that sadly, we will begin to see some of these effects. I don't if you've been paying attention to it. I'm sure you have. But the droughts that we are experiencing and the extreme weather. I was driving over on the eastern shore of Maryland here about a week or so ago. I drove around Delaware, the entire peninsula down there. And it was phenomenal to look at the corn. I talked to some farmers, and they said one of the issues was that even in some of the cornfields that they were able to water, that they were able to irrigate, the temperature was so high that it was like baking the corn, before it was put in the oven. So they were able to water some of it, but some of this corn was as yellow as a school bus because the temperatures, the extreme temperatures for so many days and or weeks in a row basically cooked the corn in the field. And we're certainly going to have to deal with this in the next 20. I would suspect that. Say the next 6 months, by the time we hit winter, we're going to see some significant increases in food prices. And what happens then?
Absolutely, it's called a supply shock. And you mentioned my book, Shoveling Fuel for a Runaway Train, which I appreciate. But I have a book coming out this winter called Supply Shock, and it's about resources left, right, around the world. Coming up against limits, or us coming up against the limits of these resources. But the grain belt in the United States, that is the current big worry for the American, much of the global economy, given the U.S. role as a breadbasket for so many countries. If the naysayers on this ought to pay some attention to what the scientists are saying about the ranges of the agronomical ranges of food plants that are moving northward. And if you were to look at some of the projections for the grain belt for, say, mid-century, we're talking about a grain belt that supposedly would be somewhere up in Canada.
Wow.
Well, yeah, it's not that simple, though. Anyone who's been up into much of Ontario, for example, knows that we're not talking about a tall grass prairie. We're talking about a lot of lakes and rivers and marshes, and not agricultural soils that we had the luxury of working with in the what people in the 20th century knew as the grain belt.
Well, that's not the half of it. Here's the other part. Let's say the grain belt moves northward up into Canada, and let's just say, for the sake of argument, that the soil was tillable and that it all worked out. What in the heck would happen to all the people that live down in what is now the grain belt? They'd certainly be I guess they'd be living in the sand belt or something like that.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, that's right, and it's a very good example of the problems caused by being obsessed with the goal of economic growth. Because remember, a lot of this corn and corn country in particular, we have converted the use of that land to produce ethanol.
Right.
Because we have already pushed the limits, the economic oil production in so many parts of the world. So we're worried about that. So now we're trying to produce so-called alternative sources of energy, and we're using up our food-growing land for that. That's just going to add to the supply shock in the grain markets.
So we're basically a snowball rolling downhill. Now I'm starting to kind of see clearly the entire issue with economic growth that you're bringing out, and that is this. The more we grow, we have a finite number of resources on the earth. The more we grow, the faster we use up the finite number of resources that we have. And we're not moving towards renewable. I mean, here's something very simple. There is a finite amount, even if it didn't affect our atmosphere, there's a finite amount of oil on the earth. At some point, 200, 300 years, whatever, we'd run out if climate change didn't get us. At that point, based on where we are now, everything would stop, and we'd basically be, the earth would be one giant Donner Pass. I guess we'd all be, eating the week or something.
Yeah, well, I think you scared them with that one. But you make a really good point, which is that, we shouldn't put make the whole issue into a climate change issue, because even without that, we had overwhelming environmental problems already mounting way prior to climate change becoming a major issue. And those issues haven't gone away. They're in spades, along with the rate of growth that we've had ever since then. So yeah, there's no way around it. I want to say something about what the Pollyannish predictors of perpetual growth.
Right.
They're going to say, well, look, progress. We're not at all forgetting about that. What they never saw, I think, and what we're little by little straightening out in the scientific literature on this, is that technological progress never just came down like manna from heaven or at the waving of somebody's wand. That technological progress itself has been a matter of growing the economy based on earlier levels of technology. So it's sort of like chickens and eggs. You know, it takes more chickens to have more eggs, takes more eggs to have more chickens. It doesn't really matter which came first. It's a positive feedback loop.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And the bottom line is, unlike chickens and eggs, we're at some point we're going to run out of space in the hen house, and I think that's where we're getting to now. I'm going to work. I'm going to tell you right now. I'm going to definitely work to promote your cause, to promote it. And your website again is
SteadyState.org.
I'm definitely going to work to promote it and to promote the idea of a steady state economy. I'm a firm believer in this, that when it comes to movements, when it comes to changes whether it was the civil rights movement or the women's suffrage movement or various other movements are not about who. They're not about a particular leader. Movements are about when. There's always a time when people are prepared to make some kind of changes based on what's happening with our weather, based on what will probably shortly be happening with our food supply and various other ways that will affect the economy. I believe that we are moving towards a time when people will begin to accept what would be considered radical ideas to change our economy for overall survival. Well, we only got a minute left, but I certainly want to thank you. And we've been talking to Brian Czech, who is a brilliant economist. He talks about ecological economics, right?
Right.
Well, that was a tough one for me. Ecological economics. Environmental economics was a lot easier. That one I had to struggle with a little bit. But I certainly thank you for doing the show. I have to get you on the radio, back on our radio show, which is the Raucous Caucus. Comes on every Tuesday from 7 to 8 p.m. on WPFW 89.3 FM. And I'm there with Mr. Mark Levine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Garland.
All right. And I'll be in touch soon. Okay. And I want to thank you. I certainly want to thank Mark for giving me the opportunity to come here to have a little fun. I hope I didn't scare you too much, but in a way, maybe it's a good idea that I did. So Mark will be back next week. You're looking at the Inside Scoop. My name's Garland Nixon. Thanks. I'm out of here.
Art, a universal language, an expression of culture, of self, and now, thanks to Empowered Women International, a way for emerging and established immigrant and refugee artists and artisans to find hope to earn a living while enriching the lives of all of us. Empowered Women International, making a better America every day. For more information on Empowered Women International's educational programs, or to make a tax-free donation, contact cfrip at AOL.com.
Here, kitty, kitty. Here, kitty, kitty, kitty. Here, kitty, kitty.
You'd think it would be easy to tell which kids have trouble with their eyesight. But that's not always the case. Even though 1 in 4 children may have a vision problem, eye doctors tell us the symptoms aren't always so obvious. We do know that 80% of all childhood learning is visual. And without good vision, kids can have trouble learning to read. and may fall behind in school. For clues on how to spot the real-life signs of childhood vision problems and what parents can do, visit checkyearly.com. A public service message from the Vision Council of America and Reading is Fundamental.
The Inside Scoop with Mark Levine.
Good news! We've got another segment here, and which means that the end of mankind is going to have to wait for at least another 13 minutes because we've got some important stuff to tell you here. My name's Garland Nixon. I'm standing in for Mark Levine, and I've just found out that it's difficult to count past 2 for me, but I'm working on it from now on. You know, that's what I get for wearing mittens. I can only count to 2. I'm going to have to take it off. So I have all 5 fingers to count with. You still there, Brian?
Yes.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, we're certainly happy to have another 13 minutes with you. Something I want to ask about, though. Again, we're going back to your book, Shoveling Fuel for a Runaway Train. You know, I can imagine that there are those who wouldn't be happy with someone who would be attempting to move us in such a radical direction away from unlimited growth because they feel they're making a lot of money from unlimited growth and that this may throw a monkey wrench in their in the economic model of unlimited profits. Have you, and I'm asking a question I already know the answer to, have you encountered any, shall we say, resistance, corporate, or maybe even in traditional educational institutions? Talk a little bit about some of the resistance that you've gotten.
Sure. Well, obviously in academia there will be biases for and against all kinds of different philosophies, programs, policy implications. But maybe one thing to note about ecological economics and the steady state economy as an alternative to growth is that the corruption that occurs in academia tends to occur wherever the money is most concentrated. So if you have maybe a department of theoretical philosophy or whatever, you know, that's probably not going to cause too many problems. But if you are, let's say, working on some type of agricultural technology, or you mentioned tobacco before, if you're dealing on the health effects of tobacco, you can count on heavy pressure by industry groups that will manifest in things like who becomes a department chair, what types of faculty are hired, who gets all the biggest grant money, and all that kind of stuff. So sure, and I have experienced that. I don't want to go into a lot of details.
Certainly, we don't want to name names and put you in a position there. But just I did want to bring out the issue that and people who aren't involved in academia do not understand how big money, whether it's corporations, lobbying groups, how these big money institutions have a tremendous effect on our educational institutions.
Yeah, and on that issue of economic growth, if you think about it. It's one of the worst because it's not only the agricultural chemical sector. It's not only manufacturing processes issues. It's not only transportation. It's not only information. It's all of those combined. It's Wall Street. It's the fractional reserve banking system. It's the economic. It's conventional economics. It's all stacked against you. However, there's a few things that are really in your favor if you happen to be a student or a young faculty member thinking about, embarking upon ecological economics, and that is sound science. You've got physics and ecology and biology and chemistry all as a rock-solid foundation for you. And also, you got common sense. I think the general public out there really does get it, that of course there's a limit to economic growth on a finite planet, no matter what they try to tell you about information economy and green growth.
Sound science. The next thing you know, you're going to be telling us to believe in evolution. Certainly, unfortunately, sound science has been rejected all too frequently by the and that's the problem. Let's be square here. We now and have always had a certain segment of our ideological segment of our country that is anti-intellectual, that intentionally rejects sound science and intentionally rejects the idea that some of our best and brightest minds should be able to influence political policy. Because the reality is, this is about political policy when it comes down to it, isn't it, Brian?
It is. I mean, when you think about, okay, if economic growth is limited and in fact it's causing more problems than it solves, well, then you think, well, what's the alternative? And that's a steady state economy. And then some people throw up their hands and say, well, there's nothing we can do about that. But there's a zillion things you can do. First of all, you think about all of the policies that currently are designed specifically for economic growth, for 3.2% GDP growth. There are fiscal and monetary and trade policies. There's the tax code. There's the budgets. There's the stimulus spending of one president after another to jumpstart the economy. The Keynesian types of policies that you alluded to before. So there are plenty of reforms that can be made in a gradual fashion, so they don't shock the economy like ultimate limits to growth will.
Now, let me ask you a question. I'm going to throw a question out to you. Of course, the opposition, the first thing they would say is, well, we're going to lose jobs, things are going to go bad. Tell me, how would a steady state economy work better? How would it work better for the average person, the average worker? How would a steady state economy be better than what we have now? Because that's going to be the argument. Well, things would go downhill.
Well, the short answer to that is most people care about their kids and their grandkids. And a steady state economy today will be far nicer to their kids and grandkids than us pulling out all the stops for growth today. So that's the short answer. And then also, there's one other reason that working toward the steady state at this point in history is much better than putting it off onto the grandkids. And that is that in the United States, for example, there's still a fair bit of fat in the economy. I mean, you still have Hummers driving around here and there. You have McMansions being built left and right. Yet, there are the unemployed, but there are many that are overemployed, overspending, and that allows society to adjust for some period of time without having a wholesale collapse.
I see. So we can the good thing is, it sounds as though what you're saying is that we can transition to a steady state economy without feeling too much of a shock.
Exactly. If we do it right away, I think that can happen without, as you say, too much of a shock.
Well, one thing's for sure, as we've been finding out, the last couple of years, with the climate changes, we're going to get a shock one way or the other. We are experiencing a shock, and with this drought, we will be experiencing some shock waves coming through our economy. One thing I wanted to ask you about, though, something came back to mind before we run out of time. We got about 5 minutes left. And it's very serious, and we just glossed over it. You mentioned something, and what you mentioned was that the projections are that the grain belt will move up to Canada at some point before the end of the century or something like that. Tell us a little bit about that. That is really serious stuff.
Yeah. Well, the biologists and ecologists are well onto this. There are many scientific studies now that show the movement of various species, especially wildlife species, plant and animal species. They no longer live where they used to. They no longer migrate as far south as they used to. They nest further north and so on. And their phenology is earlier. That's the sequence of life cycle events that plants and animals go through, seeding and flowering and pollination hatching and all these things that are part of the life cycles. So the same general principle holds with domesticated plants and animals. And the older timers out there, they see it. They know that soybeans didn't used to be grown as far north as they are now. Cotton belt is moving further north. Sugar, mangroves are appearing in places in the Gulf of Mexico that used to be salt marsh.
Mm-hmm.
You can go on and on, one after the other. And that enormous blessing of tall grass prairie that was converted to some of the richest grain crops in the history of the world. That's moving, and this summer is a horrible episode. Now, once again, we don't want to say that this summer alone demonstrates climate change, but it is one of many in recent memory that have been some of the hottest ones on record. And
well, let's not forget, you're a respectable scientist. You don't want to say that. I'm a pundit. I want to say it. Okay. You can't get away with saying that because you can't unequivocally prove it with empirical fact. I'm
right.
a pundit. I can, just kind of make things up. But it seems obvious to me, so, I'll say it.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, in a way, I do oftentimes feel limited by, the need, the scientific philosophy and need to stay very cautious. But yeah, I think there's so much common sense and evidence out there. But once again, even if there wasn't climate change, you'd have all the litany of environmental problems that are brought on by increasing production and consumption of goods and services in the aggregate all over the world.
Yeah, you are quite correct. I mean, we're in a bad situation, and things certainly aren't getting better. And, for those of us who have children, I mean, the reality is, I'm a 50-year-old man. I'm not all that worried about me. I don't think things will completely end before my few years left, but God only knows they might. But, of course, having a child, a daughter in my 20s who's married and going to college and moving on with her life, I certainly want a world for her where she can maintain a happy life. And right now, things are looking kind of scary. Well, we've only got about 30 seconds left. Once again, we're talking to Brian Czech. Thank you very much for coming on the Inside Scoop. My name's Garland Nixon, and I'm standing in for Mark Levine. Brian Czech, author of Shoveling Fuel for a Runaway Train. Brian Czech, CZ.
Thank you, Garland.
Thank you. And make sure you get that book. Mark Levine, this time I think I got it straight. Mark Levine will be back next week on the Inside Scoop. My name's Garland Nixon. Thank you for hanging out for an hour. I'm out of here.